Wow, I'm really surprised that so many people are here. Not because leadership isn't an important topic, but because they actually told you I was presenting. So I'm very humbled by it and very grateful for such interest in the topic. And I think there's a good reason for interest in the topic because at the heart of what we want to be as Christian men are leaders. And to understand what leadership is in a God-pleasing way is a challenge for us in this society. As Pastor Jeske laid out all the challenges before us, it was a little overwhelming. I'm glad he finally got to the gospel. I was pretty crushed. But he restored me, so I'm thankful for that. I want you to think for a minute about what your definition is of leadership. What is God-pleasing leadership? I want you to take a minute and try to write it down, a definition of what is leadership, God-pleasing leadership. So write it down on your booklet or something. Yes, I don't have handouts. Well, I'm willing to share the presentation later, but just take a second, think about it, and write down what your definition is of leadership. I'm not so sure it's easy to define, but I'd like you to share with the person next to you what you wrote or what they wrote. So just take a minute to share because there's going to be, I bet, 50 different definitions. Okay? Or if there's 75 of us, there'd be 75 different definitions, maybe 150. So share with the person next to you. Okay, I'm going to ask, is anyone willing to share, or maybe you can out your partner and you can say, hey, I didn't have a good one, but this guy right next to me, he had a great definition. I think he should stand up and say what his is. But anyone want to share their definition or point the finger at someone else who they think, we should listen to theirs? Anyone got one that they think, what's your definition of leadership?
We combined ours. We should to motivate one to their best or to their godly objectives.
To motivate one to their best or to their godly objectives. Okay? Good. It captures the idea of motive. And that's going to be an important part, okay? What you're trying to do. Okay? Something else. Some other definitions.
Finding ours to you're the first to serve in supporting, encouraging, guiding others to ensure success of the team.
The first to serve in guiding, supporting, and leading others as part of the team. Okay? Captured it. Great. A lot of the essence of servanthood in it. Okay? I think you, anyone else want to share one they think, okay?
Ours here together, someone who takes the lead, being a humble, loyal servant.
Someone that takes the lead in being a humble servant leader. So there's initiation in that. There's direction in it. I want you to think of different characters from the Bible that you would describe as leaders. Anyone want to share some? You think, here's a leader in the Bible? David. Okay. Great leader. God's people. Paul, okay, in the New Testament. Moses, others. Joshua. Jesus, yeah, the ultimate. Gideon, okay, David, we got. John the Baptist. Nehemiah. Yeah. And there's just lots of them. One of the reasons why I would say we could have as many definitions of leadership is that there isn't one that you can look to and say, this is the definition in the Bible. Or this is the leader in the Bible. Because all those people you just mentioned, very different leaders. We have a lot of different ways our society, our culture, and our perception of leadership shapes what we think a leader is. What I mean by that is there's the hero leader, like the Samson or the Gideon. There's the visionary leader, and we might go, well, like a Nehemiah. There are the leaders like David. There's just so many different definitions. And culturally and society, what you would look at in leadership books, you can find 100 different definitions of leadership and different aspects of it. I want to focus on 3. And I'll just mention them now, and we'll kind of cover them as we go along. And that will be the who, the why, and the where. The who, the why, and the where of leadership. Who you are, why you're doing, which got to motive, why you're doing what you're doing, and where you're leading to, what your mission is. I want to focus on those kind of three parts. Who you are is part of being a leader. Why you're doing what you're doing is an essential part of a leadership. And where are you going? Where are you trying to lead yourself and others? Okay, your mission. So it has to do with character, it has to do with motive, and it has to do, finally, with mission. Okay? One of the challenges is because there's so many definitions of leadership and so many different ways that people perceive what a leader means. I think this quote is helpful for us to kind of have on our hearts as we begin this. We must approach the issue of leadership on Jesus' terms, not ours. The concepts and values he shared with his disciples may not be the familiar categories of our contemporary management textbooks or our manuals of church administration. The metaphors he chooses may not imply the same patterns of leadership behavior that are familiar in our churches. A lot of times leadership is defined as things like influence or authority, position, responsibility, and it may be all of those things. But we really want to focus in on, well, what does Jesus define for us as leadership, or how can we summarize it? Okay, you know what a simile is, or a metaphor. It's a comparison between two things that are unlike for the purpose of showing something through that that's going to add meaning to them, okay? Basic English, you know this. But a metaphor or simile, I want to focus on David and his definition of leadership. At the end of his life, through inspiration, David, in 2 Samuel, tells us something about leadership that I think is worth focusing on. This is from 2 Samuel chapter 23. And these are the last words of David. The inspired writer begins, "The oracle of David, son of Jesse, the oracle of the man exalted by the Most High, the man anointed by the God of Jacob, Israel's singer of songs." So there's a pretty good intro to it, that we're not just talking about some unimportant words of David. These are his last words to his family, the last words that are recorded for David. And they are even described as an oracle. So this is through inspiration, David is speaking to his family, and he's finally speaking to us about leadership and what it means to be a leader. And David, who knew something both about leading in a godly way and the failures in his leadership morally and even in direction and mission at times. So at the end of his life, here's what he has to say of what it means to be a God-pleasing leader. And these words are ones that I don't think we ever look at very often. I've never heard a sermon preached on them, and I've not seen much written about it. But listen to how David begins. "The Spirit of the Lord spoke through me. His word was on my tongue." Again, acknowledging the inspiration. "The Lord, or the God of Israel, spoke. The rock of Israel said to me." Here it is. "When one rules over men in righteousness, he rules in the fear of God." There goes the first. Who you are is essential to leadership, to God-pleasing leadership, okay? Who are you? It has to do with your character. So the one who rules over men in righteousness, he rules in the fear of God, in his faith relationship with God, in his becoming relationship with God, because we're never arriving, right? But God chooses to put us in positions of leadership. Whoever we are, everyone who's in here is a leader in a different way, whether it's at work, in their family, in their church, in their community. I think that's why the topic's important to us. And every one of us has a different role of leadership, but we're all trying to do what David is describing, to be men who lead in righteousness. Okay, so there's his beginning. And now the metaphor that I want to focus on. He continues to describe it in word pictures. David the poet, through inspiration, describes what leadership is to do and to be in this metaphor. He, talking about the one who rules in righteousness, is like the light of morning at sunrise on a cloudless morning. This picture is one I actually had the privilege of taking in the Holy Land, watching over the Sea of Galilee. Imagine Jesus' disciples laying there along the seashore, huddled up, pulling their cloak over their head because they didn't have a hotel to stay in, remember? What would it be like watching through the night? What's God trying to say to us through inspiration of David about leadership in a way that can be memorable to us? Jesus used word pictures too constantly to try to describe stuff. Here's David trying to give us a picture of what leadership is and does. Try to describe to the person next to you, what do you think his point is? That this is what leadership is like. So what's the point? What is leadership like? What does it do? And how is it like that, this comparison? What is he comparing it to? Take a minute, talk to the person next to you the same way about, what do you think he's saying? What's the point? Okay, anyone want to share what is the point of comparison between what it would be like without the leader there, a godly leader, and with the leader there? So what's the comparison he's trying to make between the two? Anyone want to give some thoughts? What did you share? I have to imagine the situation if you don't have a sunrise. What's the night like? Dark. Okay? Endless. Okay? And maybe you've had a few nights like that where you're just laying in bed and you're going, when is it finally going to be morning? I can't sleep. Okay? Other things that might be without this light coming that you'd be feeling.
Hard to see direction where you're supposed to be.
Okay, we've got lights everywhere, and we don't sleep outside very often. And when we do, we bring our lamps, and we bring our tents, and we do all these other things. I've only camped once in my life in a place where there was no light. I was a vicar in Australia, and while I was there, I had the chance to go into the outback on a 3-day camping expedition with 4-wheel drives into the middle of the wilderness. There were not street lights or city lights within 100 miles of where we were. I've never seen stars like that. I've never, though, also on a cloudless, in a desert terrain, felt a day go from 90 degrees to freezing. Okay? Think of David, shepherd boy, sitting out under the stars. No city lights. The fires have gone down. What's that night like for little shepherd boy David until the sun rises? Lonely. Uncertain. Remember, David's the one who had to use the sling. We've got enemies out there. Ooh, ooh. You know, the sounds of the night. The enemies that could be approaching. Darkness is a fearful thing. Not for us, it seems like so often. We look forward to the night, right? Yeah. But the comparison that the shepherd boy is making for us about this is, think of what it would be like without that. On a cloudless night in an arid country, a desert country, primarily Israel, that when there's no clouds, it gets colder. The sun may be warm during the day in the desert, but it gets really cold at night. And you're out there. Godly leadership, then, is like the opposite of that. Okay? And I just say this is an interesting metaphor that he uses to try to drill into our heads. What does godly leadership then do? So that's what it would be like without it. Now let's say the other side of it. He's trying to compare what it's like with godly leadership, God-pleasing leadership. So what does God-pleasing leadership do compared to the night and the darkness and the enemies and the fear? In contrast to that, what's his point? Warmth. Warmth. Because the sun starts rising and okay, I can pull my cloak down now. Jesus' disciples can shake off the fear. Okay, you look forward to it. Okay, vision, clarity. You can see. You can't see in the darkness. You don't know where you're going. You don't know what's going to happen. Now you can see. You're providing some path, some hope that you wouldn't have otherwise. The warmth. All of those things are what he's trying to say godly leadership is like. Then he continues with a second metaphor of what godly leadership is like. He, the godly ruler, is like the brightness after rain that brings the grass from the earth. Okay, talk with your partner about that one. What do you think his point is? What it'd be like without it and with it? And what does it have to do with godly leadership? Why is God speaking to us through David, through inspiration, and saying this is what it means to be a godly leader? Take a minute and just talk with your partner about that. Okay, I see about half the guys are talking. They finally took Pastor Jeske's advice to start to become more talkative. And the other guys were like the guys in the fishing boat going, yep. Got it. What do you think? What's the comparison here? What is it like without the brightness after the rain? What's the point of comparison here in the metaphor? Okay. You don't have brightness after the rain without the rain. Okay? So you've got the rain. What is the rain doing? It's the storm. Think about what is it like in a storm? But there's something after the storm. Think of the storm, though, on a couple sides. Again, David is living in an arid area of the world. But the interesting thing about Israel, put a drop of rain on something and something starts growing. California's a lot like that, in an amazing way. Very similar climate in some ways, because it's rather desertous, but any source of water seems to bring life. But you have to have the rain to have the growth. This is not a desert area that I've got a picture here of. It's actually Nepal, and it's the Himalayas in the background. But it's just a glamour travel shot, sorry. But the thought is, in the background, you have storms. Tell me some of the leaders that we've talked about in the Bible who didn't have a storm before they led, or who weren't the ones who came out of the storm to lead. Gideon, think about the period of the Judges. David, how many years did David have to flee from Saul? What was his life like as God prepared him to lead? Others? Do you have one? Other people that you think of it as leaders, but God used them after the storm? Noah. Well, there's a good one after the rain, right? Thank you. Yeah. Elijah. Yeah. God had some of the most important work for Elijah, after the storm. Joseph. Oh my goodness. Think of think of the storm of his life, but the leadership that God was preparing him for. Everyone. I don't think of a single leader that was truly a godly leader that God didn't bring through the storm. Because God uses the storm to help prepare us to lead afterwards. Do you have a single, and I think as a pastor, pastors who, how to put this? If a pastor also doesn't understand what it's like to go through the storm, he's not ready to step into the pulpit. That he hasn't taken first the message he's going to share to his own heart and realize what it says to him, and then to share with his people, but also just life experience. There's such a blessing that comes from heartache. You don't think of it at the time. You don't want it at the time. I think in my own personal life, some of the storms I went through. I went through a divorce while I was in the ministry. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. I don't have enemies, but I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Terrible experience. Stayed in the pulpit during that experience. But all of a sudden, people came out of the woodwork who are having marital problems or who were still struggling with the divorce they had gone through. All of a sudden, I was ministering to people about dealing with divorce in a way I never imagined I could have or understood, because they came to me saying, I think you get what pain I'm feeling. And it was 20 years ago I went through this divorce. Okay, let's talk about it. Because God prepares leaders often for whatever they're going to do through the storm. And after the storm, brightness. Okay? So you're going to have those experiences, and you don't wish them, but they're necessary for what precedes or what will follow them. Okay? So, David's point. What does that have to do with leadership then? Where does it flow? What happens after the storm? the brightness, the light, the rainbow, the hope. And leadership is about bringing that and seeing how the growth comes from the storm. God chooses to allow all of us in our personal lives and our lives as leaders to go through the storm for the sake, ultimately, of bringing us to a place where we can serve others. He takes a Peter and lets him go through the storm, warns him the storm's coming, but he has a plan for how he's going to use Peter. He takes a Paul, who he allows to persecute the church, but he knows in the end, I'm going to knock him off his high horse, and I'm going to bring him down to the place where I can use him then. And he does it for us. So instead of rejecting the storm and praying that God would never send it, we have to have that attitude that someone who might live in a desertous climate would have, where they look at the storm as a blessing. And even though you're in the middle of it, you're waiting for it to end, because you know it'll be used in God's way. And just like if you lived in the desert and you were David, you would welcome the storm. Be happy when it's done. Welcome it, because you have no growth without it. That's the way God chooses to use difficulties in our life, with His plan and purpose for using us as His leaders. There are two, essentially, ways that you can lead. And Jesus will finally describe those to us. The world's way and God's way. Jesus' way, the way He wants us to lead. And He wants us to choose to lead like He led. I'm not going to tell you that's easy. I hear a lot of definitions for leadership, as I said before. I'm in a program, a doctor of ministry program, and have taken a couple things on leadership. Doesn't make me an expert. It means I'm a learner, and I'm trying to figure this all out. But in one of the courses I took on leadership, the professor, very interestingly, took little schnipples of paper of all the definitions of leadership that have been given in the last about 70 years, because this has become a huge topic. That's why we're all here, right? We're interested in it. And the Bible doesn't give us just one definition, one way to lead, and that's part of the problem. I look at Nehemiah and I say, oh, he's a leader. I should be Nehemiah. And I look at Joseph and I said, Joseph's a leader. Boy, I'd like to be second in charge of, I'll do that way of leading. And it's interesting. He took all of these little schnipples of paper and mixed them up and said, here's the definitions from the last 70 years when America and the world sort of got really interested in the concept of what it is to lead and the different ways it's evolved over that time. So he set them all out and asked us to try to group them, which was an interesting activity because there's certain ones, you could group them into patterns. At a certain point, leadership was all about the heroic, the person who would, again, take charge, take command, and get it done. And that was one of the definitions of leadership. Today, really we're into the influence part of leadership. I don't know if you hear, if you read John Maxwell, and I'm not saying you should, I'm just saying John Maxwell's big thing was for a while, leadership is influence. Okay. By that definition, Adolf Hitler was one heck of a leader. Yeah, he was, but he's not a godly leader. And I think it's a really narrow-minded or a short-sighted view of leadership. It's not just influence. There's an influence to leadership, but it's an insufficient definition of leadership. It's part of the concept, but it's not the whole thing. So there's different ways that it's proceeded, but if you take all those things, you see all these different definitions, and finally, I would say there's still only two ways: God's way or the world's way. And the reason why so many of these definitions keep changing and they have different emphases for a certain time, and then we switch to a different kind of leadership style, is because the world's looking to try to figure out leadership, and they haven't got it yet. Jesus reveals it to us. Leadership in the kingdom is not the way secular leadership looks at it. And our challenge, I think, as Christians, because there's so many of these books and good things out there in corporate world and everywhere else about leadership, to take that and each of them, every one of those definitions I was talking about, had a glimmer of truth to it. Influence has a glimmer of truth to it, but it's not the whole definition. Hero may have a truth to it, only, I think, in the idea of taking initiative. Because not all of us are going to be Samson. That's good. So they each have a truth, and our temptation is to take that and go, let's polish that up a little bit. Let's take that, and there it is. We'll get the rough edges off of it, and we'll say, that's what it means to be a leader. Take charge. Be in charge. Authority. Okay. Jesus says about this, not so with you. Jesus instead describes an entirely different pattern from the way the world thinks or corporate world thinks, a radically different system, in which he says, there's only 2 rules. Here are the 2 rules. It's not hard to remember. Rule number 1, lead through serving. Rule number 2, don't do anything but rule number 1. Okay? There's no other manner of leadership. And the temptation is always to take one of those other ways. If I'm just influencing people, then I'm a good leader. But not if I don't have that triad I just talked about at the beginning. The who, the why, and the where. And all of them are centered on the way Jesus is going to lead us. So, leading is through serving. Jesus is the head of this new human family. He is calling us to leadership in our many different roles that we have. We are part of a fallen family, and we have been part of a fallen family. Jesus is this new head of a new family. He's leading us in a different way. His goal is for us to identify with God. Jesus does. Think about the way he identifies with his Father. Because when he's talking about where he's going, okay, where am I supposed to lead? What am I supposed to do? Jesus goes to his Father. And he says, I'm going to identify with you. If there's another way than this suffering thing, Jesus says in the Garden of Gethsemane, if there's some other way of leading instead of serving and giving up my life, being sacrificial, please let me take that other way. Father says no. But he identifies with his Father. At the same time, Jesus identifies with his human family. He identifies with us. He calls us his brother. He sleeps on the ground with his disciples. He comes down to this earth and identifies with human beings in a way that is hard for us to imagine. And he gives us his glory. He shares with us. Jesus is showing us a pattern, and that's kind of the purpose of the slide. For us to be leaders, our goal is to abandon our old identity, to put on the new self. Okay, the old way of doing things, the old world's way of saying, to be a husband is to be the authority and to take control. Temptation. Yes, you're in a position of authority and responsibility. But the world's way of dealing with that is like I've seen some stereotypes of, I'm in charge. That's not really what he's talking about. I'm first to serve. So abandoning this old identity, just to compare the old identity to the new identity. The old identity, the way Jesus' identity is, he's equal with God. He has dignity. We are created by God. He doesn't try to hold on to equality with God, thinking of the Philippians passage. He doesn't say, that's all about me. I've got this authority. I've got this responsibility. No, he empties himself. He becomes like us. He humbles himself. He's obedient, and he's willing to die for it, for us. Compare that to our self, our natural self, our self that we inherited from Adam through Eve. We're created by God. They tried to seize equality with God, be like God, tried to fill themselves, hoped to become like gods. They became proud. They rebelled. Physical death was a result, eternal death without Christ. That's the old self. And we're putting on the new self of being like Jesus. So abandoning that old identity is then embracing my new identity in Christ, putting on the new self, as Paul talks about in Colossians. And then I identify with others. When Paul is talking to the Philippians and saying, your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but instead, taking the very nature of a servant, humbled himself and became obedient, even to death on a cross. Your attitude should be like that, Paul says. We're identifying with others in the way that we, like he treated us, we treat others. And then We also are to identify with God in the same way that Jesus did, our heavenly family. So we know we stand with one foot in both worlds, both identifying with people and identifying with God. Now, that gets into the practical of how do we do that? And there's where the dangers are. One of the dangers, as we try to identify with people and try to serve them, and know my job as a leader is to worry about other people. It's very easy then, if you're out of balance, to serve people rather than God, and to put people in the driver's seat, even though there's truth to you're supposed to serve people. Saul is a good example of that. Saul was out of balance when he's waiting for Samuel to come and make the sacrifices. I don't know if you remember this story from 1 Samuel chapter 13. He's waiting to make the sacrifices. He's had a battle with the Philistines. He wants the victory. And Samuel doesn't come. And he doesn't come. And he's getting nervous. And the soldiers are starting to leave because they're nervous too. And so leader Saul says, the way to please the people is to make the sacrifices myself, in direct opposition to what God had said. So he's out of balance. He identifies with others. He's worried about his soldiers. That's all good. But he makes the sacrifices he's not supposed to. And Saul gets there and he finally says, what are you doing? You knew what God said, but you have been worrying about people more than you were worrying about your relationship to God. And there's a temptation as we try to serve others to make sure everyone's harmonious and keep everyone happy and please people, when I also have to be worried about my identification with God at the same time and do what He wants. So there's a danger. The other side of that, the other danger, the other cliff you can fall off on the other side of the road, or the rut on the other side of the road besides people pleasing on this side, is kind of thinking, I'm all about my relationship with God. And people are sort of an annoyance to me. Because if they would just be more like me, well, then the world would be a lot better place. Because I got it all together, and they don't seem to have it together. And God, I thank you, God, that I'm not like those other people. You hear that, right? Then you become the Pharisee. You're identifying with God. You think you're doing what He wants. But He's saying, just a second, let's turn your attention away from yourself, and let's turn it towards where it should be directed, to serving others, but not losing sight of your relationship with me. So there's a temptation to lose touch with others, even as we try to get more and more into His Word. Satan is so skillful at pulling us off one side of that road or the other. And we all know people like that. And we all have to look in the mirror constantly to make sure, is this decision I'm making in my family or in my work to avoid a conflict, because I know the godly thing to do is this, but if I do this, it's going to perturb these people over here, and they're not going to be happy, and it's a lot easier just to do what they want than to do what He wants. Those are the struggles that we go through in the daily decisions we have to make in our roles of leadership. Trying to love people enough that we also help them love God. The servant leader understands they're part of a fallen family. I think there's a danger for all of us to imagine that leadership is something that is only one style. And I mentioned different leaders like Nehemiah. Not everyone's supposed to be Nehemiah. What does Nehemiah have? He has this vision. And I think there is an aspect of leadership that people imagine that unless you're this visionary, you can't be a leader. Do we need visionaries as leaders? Absolutely. And God gives some people with those talents. He uses some people with that. Does everyone need to be a Nehemiah? Does every leader need to be a Nehemiah? Is everyone gifted to be a Nehemiah? No. Nor a Samson or a David. We're gifted in different ways by God. My point with that is, He has chosen you all to be leaders, even though you're very different. Anyone here taken Strength Finders? Anyone taken Strength Finders? A few? Okay. I'll just give you the brief overview, and I'm not doing a commercial for it. It's a secular program, but I'm telling you, I think it connects into some spiritual truth in a lot of ways. Strength Finder says, instead of looking at your weaknesses, you ought to look at your strengths. Well, there's an interesting thing. Because you've been gifted in a certain way, and the psychologists and psychiatrists, you're wired in a certain way. This is the way you work. And you'll be happier when you work the way you work. You'll do better. You're going to be, just a lot more productive if you play to your strengths during your weaknesses. And the whole point of Strength Finders is find someone to help you with your weaknesses while you play to your strengths. In my top 5, and what it does is a test, then when you take it, you see your strengths. That's how God made you. Achiever is my top. Competitor, those also have dark sides, by the way, but they also have positive sides. Futurist, strategic, and communication are my top 5. We, with our leadership team at Wisconsin Lutheran High School, every one of our leadership team members has taken this test. Some of these things in Strength Finders are in the area of executing, meaning you're a doer, and I want to get things done. Okay, that's an achiever, and competitor are both, let's get things done. Achiever is let's get things done. Competitor is I want to win as we do these things. So it's not all bad. I want to win with God. If we keep the focus right, we're all right. Some of them are in relations, in the way that you relate to other people. None of my strengths are really in relation. What does that mean? Well, it means my wife completes me because she's all in relations. And not every woman is a relation, and it's different between all people. My point is, in our team, we have a balance of these gifts. It was amazing when we sat down and took these tests individually, compared them, and how accurate they were. But then it helped us appreciate the team that God had brought together. I have certain gifts that I could be leading in a certain way. I feel like you don't have to take the Strength Finders test to figure this out. But one of the biggest challenges we have in leadership is that I look at someone else as a leader and say, I'm supposed to be, because that's what a leader is. I'm supposed to be Nehemiah because Nehemiah was a leader. Yep. But if you're not futurist, if you're not strategic, probably that's not you. But you might be this person. And if you kind of looked at some of the characters of Scripture and the different leaders that are in the Bible, you start seeing they're not all alike. They have totally different gifts. And that's the point. And that's part of the reason why I don't think there's just one definition of leadership or one attribute of leadership. There's all these different aspects of it because one doesn't fit all. And yet, you're in a fallen race, and God has chosen to use you in these different ways. He makes you a leader even though you're fallen. And He puts you through the storm as He prepares you for leadership. We look towards Jesus, the head of this new family, who wants us to identify with people and with Him. And we identify with God as we worry about our character, as we obey God's will. And we worry about our relationship with people as we serve others. So I have 2 aspects, primary aspects of who I'm supposed to be. It's my relationship with God, that's who I am. That's who I'm becoming, is maybe a better way of putting it, in my life of sanctification, who I'm striving to be in Jesus Christ through His grace. And then I'm serving others. And that's a constant challenge, the daily decisions I have to make and you have to make of what's the most loving thing to do. What's the most other-centered thing to do in this case, instead of what's my natural view, my old self, which is what's best for me in this? What makes my life most comfortable? And in that, the reality is you'll be wounded and you'll be conflicted because you're trying to do something that's very difficult, of serving God at the same time serving men, of being other self, because you're still part of a fallen family that's on its way to becoming what God wants, and it's a process. And our leadership then is that striving to serve while being wounded in the process. And if that's not what you see in Jesus, you think about how Jesus identified with people. Can anyone give me some examples of how He clearly loved people? And you just see these examples of Jesus caring about human beings. I mean, you can think of dozens of them. Okay, He's identifying with sinners. He's at Zacchaeus' house, that tax collector, some lavish affair. Do we really? I mean, think of how that money could be used in other ways, and you're taking that money from him. It's blood money. What? The woman caught in adultery. He doesn't pick up the stone. And yet God condemns adultery, right? Yes. Keeps it in balance. Heart aches. So, I mean, you can just see lots of them. At the same time, he's identifying with God. And he cries over what he sees with the people he's trying to bring together into God's family. The new family leads. We're trying to put ourselves in that role of following. The new family leads in a lot of ways. Here's some examples. We have peace, so we don't beat ourselves up. I really appreciated the comments that Pastor Jeske made about how hard we are on ourselves, on those voices that go inside of us. But we let the peace of Christ reign. And think of that, it's a flexing, it's a constant need to have the peace of Christ reign in us. We continue to strive and struggle to obey God's voice, to listen to it. That means getting in the Word. My sheep hear my voice. The only way you can hear it is get to know it, to be in the Word, to do what the Word says. Finally, we're concerned about putting it into action. And in that whole process, we suffer. Boy, that doesn't sound like good news, Pastor Fisher, to share with us right now. Listen to the way, though, Paul tells Timothy that this is exactly what will happen. 2 Timothy 3, verse 12. In fact, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Okay, there's the happy, cheery news for you today in leadership, in the home, and in the church, and in the family, that it's going to be a struggle. But it's in that you and I identify with Christ. We suffer in this fallen world. Here's a definition that I've stolen. It's not my own. I've tweaked it a little bit, but I think it tries to capture several aspects. Leadership is taking the initiative. Okay, there's that initiative part of it. That gets something started, do something, take control because you care about something happening. That's leadership. But it's taking the initiative to know God deeply. There goes character. Who are you is as important as a leader as what you're accomplishing. That's not guy talk. Guy talk is what you get done is the only thing that counts. That's the way we view ourselves. If that guy's not getting it done at work, if they're not getting it done in my family, that's what I'm going to judge them on, their performance. And I understand that we all have to have a performance rating at the end of the day. We have to get stuff accomplished. We feel good when we do. But taking the initiative is not about just getting things done. It's about who we are, okay? And if you get everything done and you accomplish all kinds of tasks, but your character is wrong, then it means nothing to God, okay? And we know that, but we have to be reminded of it. Because I have a sinful part of me that just thinks, as long as I'm getting stuff accomplished, that looks godly, it's all right with God. So it's taking the initiative first and foremost to worry about my character of who I am. So to know God deeply, and then to reflect His holy character abundantly. And that's a growing process. And through loving relationship, to draw others together in the fulfillment of God's creative purposes in this world. I want to go back to those three things. I said the three, what I would call are like three legs of the stool of leadership, and you can define it in a lot of different ways, that's fine, have to do with the who, the what, and the where. The who again. Who you are, that's your character, and I need to be working on that all the time. That's my daily repentance. That's my daily reconnecting with God through His Word and in my prayer life. That's who I am and wanting to become and grow to be. Who am I? Because I can't be a leader unless I'm in that. So who? Then there's the what. And that's the actions that I want to carry out. I mean, leadership is about action. It's about getting something done because of who I am. There's the, now, what am I trying to do? What is this? And then there's the where is also with that. I'm sorry. The why. I'm getting messed up. Who, where, what, and why. And God's concerned about all three of those. So the why is your motive. What motivates you to do this? And you see that in the selflessness and in this loving relationship, that it's about others. It's that constant challenge of why am I making these decisions? Not just what the decisions are. I've got a place I'm trying to go, but God's concerned about who I am in it and why I'm doing it. I want to talk about these three things and have you talk about these three things. I know it's a lot of theory, but I'll go back to those metaphors. Think about the dry, arid land. Think about the dark night. And think about what does it look like for you if God is calling you to a radically different way that the world thinks of leadership in your home, in your church, at work. What does that look like? I want you to just start on the home, and then we're going to talk about that one. And then we'll move to work, and then we'll move to church. Okay? But talk within your little group or with a couple people about what if God's calling you to this radically different way of leadership than the world thinks, and the way that Jesus says, not so among you. Whoever wants to become great will become the servant of the other, slave literally. Okay? What does that look like in the home? Let's start there. Talk with the person next to you about what challenges does that cause, and what could it look like? Okay? What did you talk about that you'd say, boy, that's challenging. This would make me to think about it a different way in my home. Any examples or thing you want to share that you shared in your group about what might be different? What does it look like in the home that could be either challenging or, I hope, a little different way of looking at it? You probably should raise hands, not all shout out the answers at once. Anyone want to share? Please. Okay, there's that wounded servant thing you're describing. Okay, I'm trying to just lead by example. And that's the most important thing. By the way, children will follow their fathers more than their mothers on church attendance. If dads go to church, all trends, statistics point to you're most likely going to get your kids. If mom goes, much lower percentage. It's unbelievable the difference over time. Okay, so it does play out, but you're balancing between what I want to do for God and what God's demands are, right, and obeying Him, and being careful not to please them. Meaning, well, they're 16. If they want to sleep in on Sunday, I guess I got to just let them because I don't want them to have. I don't have the argument with them over this. There's the wounded part of how do you get at them that you open up your heart to them and why it's important. I don't think just as the dad pulling rank and saying you're going at 16. Now, the 5-year-old, yeah, I'm pulling rank. But there's a certain point where you're opening up your heart to him why it's important. And you're wounded over it, and you're letting them know because you care about it. That's hard. It's a lot easier to pull rank. That's the way the world would say, lead by, doggone it, you're 16, under my roof, you don't eat unless you go to church. You don't eat God's word, you don't get to eat. You could try that. It won't work. Okay. Any other examples or thoughts?
Offering advice when requested is good, but also explain how you understand why this advice.
Thanks. That's sometimes, again, I think the role of being the head of the house, which you are to be, is the notion that somehow I don't need advice. I've got it all figured out. It's that hero kind of definition of leadership. I've got it. I will do it. I take care of it. And to be able to say, I don't know if I've got this figured out. I need some help here, is actually very, very different and very servant-like. I need others to help with me.
I think the biggest part is the hearts and the wills and the minds.
Wonderful comment. Again, if you didn't hear it, that you're trusting that God, if I'm identifying with God, it's really about that faith relationship, that trust relationship. I'm constantly having to say, this isn't mine. I'm serving someone. I'm going to give it back to him. I'm a steward of it. And he's still in control, and I'm going to do what he knows. I know from what he has told me to do, but I'm going to trust that he's going to get the rest done.
Ultimately, our families are just borrowed to us. We're all here.
Right. And they're broken vessels too that God chooses to raise up and to give and trust you with, despite the fact that you have the frailties.
Get to know God through His Word.
Yeah. Critical to get to know God through His Word. Absolutely. To keep identifying with Him, to get direction from Him. I heard others kind of move into these other subjects. Anyone? Let's do these other two kind of more in a group setting. Anything that you see that this might apply to work or church that's different? You say, boy, I got to radically think about what that means. I'll give one from church. God has put you in a position of leadership, headship, not only in the home, but also in the spiritual family of God. We, I think, can characterize that in a way that actually hurts the women that are in our church. If I am going to be the Christ-like leader in my church, does that mean, I don't want to hear anything what the women have to say, I've been put in charge here. Okay? Doesn't it mean the exact opposite? If I'm a servant, what is going to serve our women best? 5 men at a voters meeting making the decisions without consulting the women in the congregation or knowing what their thoughts are on something? Is that abdicating your spiritual leadership? Or is that really your spiritual leadership? By saying, we got to make the decisions, God put us in charge. No, it isn't. In fact, the opposite is true. That you are more concerned about others than just, well, what's best for the men in this congregation? We got to make the decision because we're in charge. No. Instead, we are working hard for them to realize that we're there to serve them and we're looking out for them. That we work hard at making that happen. So it doesn't mean we abdicate our role in a leadership, but it means we serve in a different way that sometimes is not the caricature of what people think it is to be the leader. Okay? Well, I think we're running out of time. In fact, I know we're running out of time. I thank you for the privilege of being here and the opportunity to share with you, again, Jesus' radical different way of looking at what it means to be a leader. God bless you in your roles of leadership. If you leave with one thing, it is this thought that you are leaders, but you're not supposed to be cookie cutters of each other. You're different because God gifted you in a different way, and you are a leader because He has called you to that in your home, in your church, in your family. And may God bless you in accepting that role with joy. Thanks.